Right, so hello everyone and welcome. It's an absolute pleasure to have you all here today. Bienvenue. We are absolutely delighted to welcome Olivier Marboeuf, who is currently participating in a Banister Fletcher Global Fellowship, which is hosted by the University of London Institute in Paris. Recently, he joined us actually at Senate House on the 4th of March when he held such a rich and fantastically vibrant gathering of minds, I would say, which was called Distant Island Spectral Cities, Weaving a Spiral of Archives in London. And I'm sure that Olivier will talk to you a bit about his takeouts from that activity, that day-long event, really, and everybody who was involved with that. So it gives me great pleasure then to present to you Olivier's to present him to you today, who will be speaking on the Black Caribbean Archive Sites, Methods and Imagination. So Olivier is from the Caribbean diaspora of the Paris region. He's an author, a storyteller, an artist, curator and film producer. He has published several essays, poetry collections, and numerous texts of cultural criticism around the aesthetics of secrecy and masquerade, performance, and cunning as techniques of resistance to the extractive economy of contemporary art. His work focuses on forms and infrastructures of minority transmission, as well as knowledge commons. It combines aesthetics of presence, fugitivity, and abolitionist politics in order to develop new forms of research, representations, and places based on an ethics of complicity. So, without further ado, Olivier, over to you.
Thank you, Hez, and thank you all the people that have been able to attend today for that talk and presentation. Firstly, I would like to say that I'm speaking today with in mind the situation in Haiti, where I got a lot of friends and colleagues, which is really a drama. So I'm still receiving on the WhatsApp group some news of my friends and peers. And I think about them, and I would like to dedicate the talk today of what Haiti is going through at the moment, because Haiti is and still is very important places for Caribbean politics and imagination and the Caribbean aesthetic. So today I would like to share with you some elements. I would call it methods, but I will say some elements I'm really working on at the moment as part of my research for the Banister Fletcher Global Fellowship at University of London in Paris. And this research is based on, I could describe it firstly really quickly, and afterwards I will talk about more the origin of that research, some of tools of that research, some open question, and so it will be afterwards occasion to talk with you about those tools and those paths, because the research is really ongoing, and I would like, it's important for me that each conversation is indeed there to fit that research, which is also a part of my collective practices. As Eve said, I'm coming from a art background, and I'm also a writer, and I will talk about today about storytelling and images, and try to address the question of archive in a particular way, and I think in the trying to build a Caribbean perspective on it. So the first thing is that my research is based on a research of traces of Caribbean presence and form of life in Paris and London, so in two different places. And so I think that the first thing is that the question of traces is quite important, and I do think that it needs to create really particular tools and epistemologies to enlarge the idea of what a trace is, but also its function. So I will start with the question of the storytelling, which is really central since years in my practice. With that question, was it the function of the storytelling in the Caribbean world? We know that the Caribbean world didn't start with the slave trade, but this tragedy, which associates indigenous genocide, African enslaved destruction, and ecocide, creates something in particular: a new world, a new Caribbean world, a suspended world in between life and death, or a situation of death which reclaim another imagination for life, another path to humanity, and what I will call, after Edouard Glissant and Patrick Chamoiseau, a detour. The notion of detour is really important, that it signifies that there is no possible return to a former situation. There is a necessity of trying to find what happened, what was before, and what's gonna come in the same movement. So the detour is not a return, is a way of exploration and is based on imagination, but also on improvisation. So, of course, do a detour is not taking a way that you already know and taking a path that you already practices. It's a way of practicing a path that you have to invent in the same movement. That's why I call the detour. And I use that expression, detour to humanity, not to consider that it's possible to return to a certain form of humanity. And we have to keep in mind that in the Western global modern storytelling, the Western society create a certain idea of humanity, which is a humanity that is severed from the so-called nature. And that form of humanity that is able to produce so many ecocides, so many genocide, which not a so desirable humanity. So what is very important for me also to underline indeed with the idea of detour is that there is no more desire to become that kind of humanity. And so in the Caribbean perspective, the detour to humanity is a way to look for a humanity that doesn't exist yet. So it's a very important point, that to imagine something that doesn't exist yet. So this is to introduce the notion of detour that will be present in other aspects of my research. So the first thing that in the form of detour that we can explore together, there is obviously the first one is the detour in the language. The Creole is obviously a detour that is a sonic and a visual expression of an affected body by a human drama, but not only by a human drama, also by a journey on the side of non-human world, of what I call a dis-human world, the world of matter, the world of resources, and the world of a speaking object, as Fred Moten would phrase it. So it's really important to consider that that path to humanity is based on the detour that is not only related to human history and human violence and the so-called human global stories, but also a story based on the really particular relationship that is based on the projectionality of being dehumanized. Most of the time, the idea of dehumanization is considered as a kind of violence, what it is, but which we claim to come back to humanity. And so the detour is a form of refusal of that coming back to that kind of humanity. And it's a proposal to another kind of humanity based on that very traumatic experiences. So it's a very important point for me not to, again, in the detour, that to consider that there is a detour in the languages that we will more explore with the Creole and with the way that Creole is functioning. There is a detour in the storytelling that is aiming not to coming back, but to find other form of life that doesn't exist yet. So I will come back just to to arrive to some question and consideration for now, I will come back to the particular scene of the plantation, because there is a lot of different description of the infrastructure of the plantation, and I would like to focus on one particular figure that is not so well known and more present in the literature, which is the figure of the storyteller. The storyteller is an enslaved person, and so I would like to explore that figure and what is the situation, I would say, of the storytelling in the plantation. So we can imagine, because we got few stories about that after the day job and probably during the free day of the week, an enslaved person gathered to play music and to have time together, and that there is that person that start to tell a story. We don't know when and in which language. We have to keep in mind that the Creole is not a stable collective language from the beginning. It's really a collective performance. So the language is common, is really something that have been created through several decades and years. So it's very important to understand that the very first storytellers are in a certain way inventing the language that they are using to tell stories. And for me, it's very interesting to consider that kind of double movement of creating the condition of the story you're going to tell. That means that the language, as Lacan would say, is not a kind of first condition to be able to tell stories. In the Creole situation of the slavery, the language is coming with the storytelling, and the storytelling is challenging the necessity of the language. And in that case, another aspect is important in that, is that to consider that the language is produced at the same time that the story is produced, and the story is produced collectively, meaning that the language is immediately a common, not only something that create the possibility of communication and transmission, obviously, like all languages, but also a collective creation, which is ongoing through the storytelling. So we know few stories of storytelling, but most of the things we know in the Caribbean, that it's stories themselves. We know few things about storytellers, even if Patrick Chamoiseau did a very interesting study about the transmission of the storytellers. But what we know is that as soon as there is that kind of space for the storytelling, we have to keep in mind that the master of the plantation is already there, meaning that since the very beginning, the infrastructure of the storytelling in the Caribbean context is also related to the practice of surveillance, meaning that from the very beginning, the practice of ruse, the strategy of dissimulation, the production of coded images are really important, because I think the storyteller tried to address stories to and with other enslaved people, but with the presence of the master. So that very particular tension is important. We understand that the language is not stable, and there is a necessity of transmitting some information through the storytelling, but to try also to tell a story in what we call in Creole "embaffé." Embaffé means just story have to pass under the ear of the master. And so it creates a kind of form of the language, a kind of attention and a kind of specialization relate to the surveillance. So we say that the language is not linear. And there is another aspect, is that the story of the storyteller at the moment is not based on non-stories. It's really a permanent invention. So the storyteller is inventing a language at the same time he's inventing a story. At the same time, he's inventing the content of the story, the character of the stories. And we know that the story is repeated from one evening to another. So it's a kind of ongoing process of developing a story by repetition. And so that practice of repetition to enlarge the stories, to extend it in space is a very central element of the Caribbean epistemology I use myself in my practice of research, meaning that instead of starting from the beginning to the end, is more a movement of spiral. And so the story is expanding and becomes inhabitable spaces through that expansion. The story of the storyteller is based on rumors coming from Maroon community around, coming from story from the outside of the plantation. It's a key thing, because we have to keep in mind that the infrastructure of the plantation is based on different aspects, but one central aspect of the plantation is that the plantation itself is a storytelling. There is a storytelling of the plantation that says that there is no possible life for enslaved people out of the plantation. And that storytelling is very central because it's a way to explain how you were able to maintain so many people, because there are much more enslaved people in the plantation than people to guard them. So how to keep those people in that space, you have to use different strategy, meaning some competition in between enslaved people, some micro difference and macro privilege, but also a global storytelling, which have been really efficient for a very long time before the first people became able to get outside and to tell story back. We have to keep in mind that when people are marooning, meaning when they are flying from the plantation, they always, most of the time at the very beginning of the maroon strategy, they were staying quite close to the plantation to use some means of the infrastructure like water and other things to be able to survive, and also to be able to communicate to other slaves, to push them to join them, to become more powerful. So the place of the storyteller is interesting because it's a storytelling from the plantation, from a space of death to a possible life around, away from the plantation. So the movement of the spiral is a movement in space, talking about a space that people didn't experience yet, but in a certain way experience with the storytelling. So they got the taste of it, they got the first practice, what we will call later abolitionism, is that creating some condition to experience a situation of life, a livable life in a way, another life than the death they are living in the plantation. So there is a movement in space and a movement of time, because in that case, the storytelling got a necessity to speak about a time which is not the present time, but which is a mix on the future and a mix of the past. And I will really keep for the moment that idea of the detour of the storytelling from the plantation is that kind of movement of spiral, which is not a linear movement, and which also a movement of expansion and experimentation of a possible life in situation of death. And so that thing was very important for me to create this particular tool to make my research about traces of the Caribbean diaspora in Paris and London. It seems to be very far. That's why the fellowship is called Distant Island and Spectral Cities. But indeed, it's a way to connect, of course, two spaces, the space of the Caribbean and the space of the capitals of the empires. But it's also an attempt to create a particular tool to tell the story. Most of the time, we are really focused on the necessity of creating counter-narrative, other stories, but we don't question with what kind of language, with what kind of tool, with what kind of epistemology. And this is really a central question of what I'm trying to do through that fellowship, coming back to the plantation as a kind of first situation of an abolitionist gesture. So the first radical situation of a necessity of creating form of hope, but also capacity of practicing some first gesture of imagination to prepare a possible life. We well know now that kind of practice of rehearsing situation to come have been really also famous through the practice like capoeira in Brazil and plantation in Brazil, meaning that practice of dance was indeed a practice of rehearsing a fight to come. And so that dance is really particular to the slave situation and the plantation display too. That's why I'm interested in the question of storytelling, and I would like now to relate that question of storytelling with another question and concept, which is the question of archives. Because indeed, we can consider that the practice of preservation in the Caribbean experience that are based on violent interruptions, in a certain way, that practice of preservation need to regenerate, in a way, an archive towards the living. And of course, the idea of the archive in the Western epistemology is more based off an artifact of something that is from the past, and that we try to preserve to understand what happened. But in the situation of the Caribbean life, and even more in the diaspora situation, I would like to try to reflect about the practice of preservation as practice of invention. Because indeed, I was always trying to keep a distance with archive in my practice for a long time. Because for me, archive, the World Archive, sound a bit too administrative or a bit too related to police, and immediately remind me of that of the state, the position of the states, and that I always judge us, the Caribbean diaspora, responsible of any kind of crimes based precisely on archive, over which this state were alone on the sole power of production and conservation. So archive, for me, was in a certain way the tools of the state power. And so to oppose something to that archive, I thought that it was necessary to develop an idea of invention, of imagination, that could sound a bit counterintuitive when we are talking about archive and transmission, if you use the term invention or imagination. But I do feel that there is something in the practice of imagination that is necessary to fill the gaps related to society like the Caribbean society and the diaspora of the Caribbean society that have been produced by a series of interruption and violent forced exiles and all the kind of violent movements. So the idea of scattered territory and scattered life create that necessity of imagination as a practice of reparation. And so I would like just to quote just one aspect of that research too, that and with the two texts that have been for me influential in two different ways, and that are related to two, I will say, Caribbean thinkers. Indeed, one is supposed to be African American, but I think his family is from Curacao. It's Saadia Hartman, and the other one is Sylvia Wynter. And in my research, the reading of the Sylvia Wynter text, Plot and Plantation, that have been published in 1971 by Savaku magazine, have been very important. I will say my reading, because most of the time you understand that people they are reading texts with different kind of perspective, and it's very important also to underline that we all have particular reading some text. There is no global way of reading text. It's also related to some necessity. So I will say that reading Plot and Plantation, I found some elements that were very exciting for me. And in that analysis in Plot and Plantation, Wynter is writing about also a kind of metaphor of the practice of novel beside the practice of writing different form of literature. So she was talking about create a relation in between short fragment of text and the possibility of the short text beside the practice of the classical novel. And she's doing a kind she created a kind of reflection about the idea of interruption that have been very precious for me. She just present a series of short interruption in the storytelling of the plantation. And for her, the storytelling of the plantation is the global story of the West. And all the fragment of story she points, she tried to consider indeed what is considered as interruption is indeed a kind of global storytelling that is partly invisible and partly scattered by the dominant power. So she says, indeed, we don't have to consider that small revolts, a small practice of refusal, riots, or all that kind of events are in the only interruption of a global, let's say, state of peace, of state of stability, but indeed the expression of a global story that we need to weave. So we need to weave all together fragments of that story to create a global story. I've been very interested in that because indeed it reversed the idea that there is already a global story wrote by the West, but there is indeed several stories that are intertwined, and we can extract some fragment and rebuild something. And it's really the techniques I took to do my research for the Banister Fletcher. Not considering that the linear story of France and the linear stories of even the French Caribbean island and the linear story of my family, and beside that, the linear stories of the British Empire and the linear stories of what happened related to Caribbean, but in totally other way, taking some very particular fragment, I will just talk a bit just afterwards, and try to weave them together. And considering that all that fragment of interruption can constitute a kind of story that need to be not revealed, but in certain way invent, but in that idea of imagination as a practice of reparation, as a practice of filling the gaps in between the visibility of some stories. And it's a very important point at the moment where there is a very important movement of the Black communities, including Caribbean communities, a very important series of demands of visibility. And I do think that my research in that case is taking a kind of other direction. I won't say a counter direction, but another direction, trying to reflect about what does it mean, what means that demands of visibility of Black community. What is visibility, and visibility for who? For on what kind of scene? And as we can understand with the description that Sylvia Winter is doing for plot and plantation, small events of interruption are in a way visible and invisible. So they are the visible part of an invisible continuum. Like carnival could be the visible moments of a kind of invisible continuum, like in the voguing practice, and the voguer are very important in the scene of Paris, like in the US, for instance, and the voguing practice and the Black masculinity in the voguing practice, that most of the time practicing in kind of very invisible and precarious places, but at some point they are doing some public and visible apparition. And so that idea to be able to get out, we call it in French, une sortie, to get out, to become visible, is always a kind of moment of spin of visibility, which is not the whole practice. This is only the idea of becoming visible and challenging the society at some point, but not as a permanent form. And so that idea of ephemeral practice and permanent form and discontinuity as form of visibility have been very important, essential for me, especially at the moment where the visibility can be considered also as a trap and as a condition for extraction of Black life for entertainment and so on. And so with the consequence of exhaustion and with a lot of consequence of tokenization, and so fetishization of the Black stories and Black pain and so on. So in certain way, a kind of coming back to the situation of object or speaking object for the Black communities. And so that practice of commodification have been really, for me, a real question when I start my research, as I experience it in the contemporary art. And so I try in my research to examine the condition of visibility and even examine the necessity of visibility in a certain way, because I have to come back from the beginning. I was reflecting about the idea of what could be the detour of that demand. Because in certain way, demanding visibility to be acknowledged by a dominant society is considering that the value is produced by some people, by the dominant society, and asking to that dominant society to acknowledge us, which is for me a kind of really weird conclusion of the stories, where I do think that some practice of fugitivity, some informal practice is a way to be present. It's a political agenda that is also, in a certain way, a kind of counterattack to the violence and visibility. And so the second text that I've been interested, but in a certain way, in a different way, it was also Lose Your Mother, a journey along the Atlantic slave route by Saidiya Hartman. And with Saidiya Hartman, it's very interesting because indeed she's really somebody using a lot archive, walking in depth with archive. Each document is really a matter that she tried to understand all the small details. But in her book, in that book in particular, she arrived to a certain point where there is nothing. It's not possible to fill the gap of the absence of document that you can examine. So as as a person that was doing a form of inquiry in the archive, she arrived to that kind of gap, to that kind of blank page, and she engaged a form of journey that is partly based on imagination, is partly based on potential stories, is partly based on what could be the stories of my family from that point. So in certain ways, she refused the interruption based on the absence of the archive, knowing that enslaved people are not being able always to produce themselves archive. And so she decided to do a journey back to Africa as a way of filling that gap in a form of physical encounter, presences, but also invention. And so this is something that is very important for me in my research, to consider that working with some in the practice of archive, in my case, is not a fetishist practice, but it's a real practice related to presence. And I talk about abolitionism at the beginning, meaning that engaging with archive is not only an idea of extracting something that nobody ever known, a very new document. I will discover, because we don't discover anything. And so defending in my practice, the practice of repetition is a way to cure also in the Western perspective from that desire of inventing a new things by discovering things that nobody ever saw. And trying to propose another epistemology that is also an epistemology of repair, an epistemology of producing life, which is the practice of repetition. Coming back to the storyteller, is trying to make a fragment of story, which could be the archive, growing by repeating it in the present. And in the perspective of my research, there is really the idea of a political output from an archive, from the examination of the archive and the repetition and imagination from the archive, to create, to consider the archive not as dead artifact of artifacts that have been collected only as a fragment of the past, but to consider archive as blueprint. And this is really a central aspect of what I try to explain with the idea of blueprint, meaning that as in certain ways Sylvia Wynter tried to present in Plot and Plantation, the blueprint will be an event that happened in the past that produced something that is not totally achieved. And coming back to that event, coming back to that trace, is not only to collect it, is not only to make a collection, but is to try to experience it again, to do as the storyteller a repetition of that event, a rehearsal of the potentiality that haven't been achieved at that moment. So not considering that some struggle, for instance, some revolts, some riots, some resistance, some practice of refusal have been unproductive in a way, but considering that they haven't been achieved, which is quite different. So not say, oh, they fail of liberating themselves, but they create a first movement that we have to repeat. And for me, it's very important because I looked for a very long time on the way not to create some ownership and property in the Caribbean research, considering some people should do and other people not do, and trying to create other conditions, saying that it's not the question of who is researching what. It's not saying that some people are the owner of some cultures. There is no owner of cultures. This is the invention of the West to consider that could have owners. There is only practitioner. So the question is not who is doing that research, but what for and towards what kind of place for the future, towards what kind of living place. So who is able to invest himself or herself in the practice of repetition, in the practice of rehearsal, past events to try to make them become all the possibility for today. And so it's very important because in a certain way, using that, I frame my research in different direction, but using all that idea and keep in mind. And just to share with you, to finish some example, the question for research that I think all researchers and anybody will ask at the beginning could be where to start to tell a story. And so I try to start from a kind of intimate moment, which is really the 80s in the outskirts of Paris, when I was a young boy, and I grew on the outskirts of Paris with Caribbean communities, but also African, Arabic communities, Roma communities. And so I tried to start in a moment that I got a really personal connection with. And through that moment, I try to explore in space and time, in the same gesture than the storyteller in the plantation, all the connection that could exist during 80s, 81, 82, 83, in Paris and in London, not considering that the space of the national, let's say, channel or national storytelling is a kind of current way of telling the story, but considering that we have to cross in and to do some detours in those stories to make some connection and to see how things are coming suddenly together in another way, and to expand in time instead of saying, I'm going to start from the very beginning, from the arrival of the Caribbean people through the Windrush, for instance, or through in the UK, or for the Bimidum in France, that has two massive moments of arrival for the Caribbean people. I will start to another critic moment and try to make some connection with that moment before and also with the moment to come. So the research I'm trying to develop now is based on that kind of movement from a central point and with the expansion of the spiral in space and time. And of course, it's also a collective research, because as I said, there is no owner to the culture. And that collective research is also related to the practice of the storyteller, because I have to say that the storyteller doesn't have any audience in the time of the plantation. All the enslaved people are co-producing the storytelling by adding things, by adding some remarks, adding some other stories, and the storytellers taking all that fragment of stories and is bringing permanently them in the global stories and repeating it, create a kind of global polyphonic or cacophonic storytelling. It's very important for me also to develop a manner of telling the story that is also including a lot of voices, and this is what I did in the beginning of March in Senate House with Eve and other people, with Carol Wright, with Julian Enriquez, with Natalie Hyacinthe, with Annotate. And it was a moment to try to collectively storytell a story, so create some condition to jam together on the movements of collective storytelling, and try also me to play the role of the storyteller with that figure, which is not the author, which is not the owner of the story, but is more a kind of master of ceremony or a kind of DJ, which is trying to create a kind of form of speed that allow us to be really connecting all things together. So to be able to make efficient the spiral, there is also an issue of speed. To create the speed that create, as with when you play a record, to create a certain kind of speed and movement from beyond and so back and forth, to create a certain kind of dynamic that create that global story and that global assemblage that is based also on accident. And those accidents is coming back to Sylvia Winter when she talked about plot and plantation. Those accidents is a kind of connection between different plots. And suddenly we found some connection that we were not able to see before playing the archive, as Julian Enriquez said during our gathering. Playing the archive is finding the right speed of the conversation to create some collision and some new connections. I will open the talk to conversation now, perhaps to talk more precisely to other things and to get your question. And I will keep a little time to talk a bit about the question of monuments and about what to do with archive, how to preserve them in that living practice I was talking about, because we address in the beginning of March, the 4th of March in London, the question of the Black monumentality. And so we talk about different hypotheses that I would like to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can we give a virtual round of applause to Olivier? And also, I'd like to invite you, if you feel comfortable, to switch on your cameras. Don't worry if not, but it's nice to see some of the faces in the room and get and make this feel like more that we're a community of people sharing with each other. So that's great. So yeah, there's so much to say. Just to remind you that this session is being recorded, so if you do have a question, you can, and you don't want you want to remain behind the camera, you can put a question in the chat. Otherwise, please feel free to put up your hand now if anybody would like to ask Olivier anything. Anybody? Shayla, would you like to jump in? Just at this point, you're shaking your head.
I mean, I could, or I could. Oh.
Maybe just to share some, I don't know, some observations about the event that we did recently, because I think that would be a nice segue, I think, into more Q&A.
Maybe I'll just ask Olivier. Can you all hear an echo? Yeah.
A very slight echo.
Maybe I'll just ask Olivier to say a little bit about the Paris events in April, just in case people will be here in Paris. I'm speaking from Paris as a ULIP staff member, just to clarify.
Yeah, I think the Paris event is a way to keep on experiencing what we start in London, and indeed in London we didn't have the occasion to get outside from the Senate House, which is a very particular place, I have to say. The first time I've been there, but it's a brutalist infrastructure. But I think it's also very interesting to be there, because I think there are trays to reactivate. In Paris, we will be also in ULIP for some session, but also out in gardens, in some different places, to try to experience also the different places and traces and practices on the community, Caribbean communities in Paris. What is what was my motivation with Paris, indeed, and it's a starting point that is again, but you get that is a part of the project, is a bit counterintuitive, is that Caribbean communities in France and in Paris in particular, and in France in general, did everything what was possible to be invisible. So there is a real practice of not letting a lot of traces. And so there is some, of course, some very particular cultural sites, but indeed the carbon presence in Paris is partly invisible, not totally, but partly. And so it's also a practice of experiencing the reason of that invisibility and the form of that invisibility. And so, of course, it's also a question of what kind of tool we use to testify from a presence. What are we looking for? And so one of my research is based on the fact that a lot of practice of the Caribbean communities is based on living practices. And so it challenged us to know how to find traces of living practices, how to really build a tool that is able to see in some lot of dispersed fragments something that is there and have to be activated or reactivated and reperformed. So indeed, the week of event in Paris is also by itself a practice of rehearsal of a situation, and we're going to explore different aspects of the Caribbean visibility, invisibility, let's say. And so some important of them will relate to practice, of course, of the urban infrastructure, because the Banister Fletcher Global Fellowship is based also on the question of critical urbanism and so on. And so we will explore also how people are dealing with forms like carnival, how it's related also, carnival can be related to practice of riots, for instance, of the relation with police, of thought we'll go question, but also a lot of question also about body as an infrastructure is really things that also I work a lot reading also Stuart Hall proposal about the idea of the body as the main infrastructure and the main canvas of the Caribbean culture is something very interesting too. And so it comes to the question of monumentality, because we know that in the Western world, the representation of the story and the presence can be based on monuments as a kind of art monuments. And so we start in London, and it was really fascinating to question form of monuments, particularly because at the very recent, the last recent years, a lot of statues also have been considered that as being not appropriate, I would say, in the public space. You remember Colston in Bristol, for instance. And so the question in that case that I wrote about is that if you want to dismantle the statue, what would you put instead of it? And so in place of it. And so it have a question that I work in the Martinican context where a lot of statues have been destroyed too, but also in the UK. So I could say more about that question and what was the form of answer in London and how it will continue in Paris.
Thank you. And I thought what was fascinating about that session is that we didn't just talk about the Colston statue, but also, and inevitably, the Windrush statue at Waterloo, but also the Windrush line. And I thought that was a really fascinating way to draw together kind of talking about representations of different political monuments and figures, and kind of how that's used in all sorts of ways. And I think it was somebody reminded us that the Windrush line actually stops a 10-minute walk from the Home Office as well, which I think is a really I think that made a lot of us draw a deep breath, really, to think about how these things are interconnected and the violence that they kind of reproduce as well, I think. Okay, so we have some hands have gone up. So let's go next to, I hope I'm just going with the name that people have got displayed. So I've got Enzo, who's got his hand up.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much, Olivier, for your beautiful presentation. Well, I would like to ask you to talk more about your take on monuments and what to do with the colonial monuments in Europe. Um, I know about research that has shown that white people in some European context, especially progressive, self-identified progressive white people, are leaning to remove these traces of the colonial past in order to restore the national image and so on, and also to acknowledge the harm that has been done and so on. And but also, like, I know that some people, a lot of people are very critical about this removal option, since it will imply a form of erasure that only could morally license white people from Europe to just move on, instead of actually addressing the lasting consequences of colonial oppression. So what do you think about this debate?
Yeah, so it's a long story, but I will try to relate to what I already said and what we experienced also in London in March, in beginning of March. For me, again, I would like to come back to the idea of detour, because there is a form of temptation of considering the reparation in a symmetrical way. Let's say, let's replace the statue of a white male by a black woman. I'm joking, but not so much. Just to say, okay, so do we need to repair new figures as a statue? I just say that because indeed, when Colston statue have been dismantled, I don't know if you know that an artist from London called Mark Queen, he produced his own hyper-realistic statue by a black woman with a fist like that. He saw her in a protest. He used the photograph. He do the statue. He spent his own money to put on place on the Colston statue that black woman like that. And I wrote a text about that act, about the fact that a white male, considering being progressive, I don't know, but working also with the market of the arts. That's why I try to share that question. Had the means to produce his own statues, and less than 1 month after the statue had been unsettled, the Colston statue had been unsettled, he put back another statue of a black woman with the rising of fist. So for him, the reparation of the presence of Colston was based on an hyper-realistic black woman of today rising a fist. And so he considered that he can make alone that decision without letting time to the global community to reflect about what they want to do. And so not accepting the kind of absence that created Colston, this absence as a space which could be potentially occupied by debate, conversation, a certain form of time. So I was considering that the detour was letting really the space without anything. And for instance, in Martinique, where the statue of Josephine, the Napoleon wife, had been dismantled a few months before. And so before all the new Black Lives Matter, in other schedule, that's why my research is based just to show that it's not the assassination of a black person that create a desire of unsettling some statue. In Martinique, it happened before, for instance. And what people did, it was a woman, young woman, that activists, that they decide to create a kind of block, a small plot in place of the statue to plant something with a ground to be able to grow some vegetables in place of that. And so for me, it was a gesture of monumentality. It was very exciting, for instance, considering that it was a space for free food in an island where the ground is toxic. So the meaning was very powerful, for instance. And so I was thinking that the idea of the white statue in some places, sometimes they are archive of violence. So it's not easy to know if we have to make them disappear. There is a kind of contradiction with the disappearation of the statue. Because I think, for instance, it's very interesting to know the economy of the statue. Because I know in the UK, and I know it in France too, most of the people think that the statue in the public space are based on state decision. And they are mostly private decisions. And doing some inquiry to know who paid and what kind of pressure have been put on politics to get that statue at that moment and when, it's a story, a collective story that is very important for me. You understand a lot of mechanism of what the so-called democracy. There is a lot of statue in the public space that have been paid by private community to push a part of the. So we need to create a kind of political statement inside in the global politics. So most of the time we think it's a state-based and it's not so often indeed. So I do defend that at least we make enough work on that statue to understand where they are. What is the matter of the statue too? In Belgium, they think that Leopold II statue have to be melted because it have been built with matter coming from Congo. So the restitution is coming back to the matter with the statue and bringing back the matter. So this is different proposal. But for me, what was very interesting in the reflection about monumentality is letting the gap, letting the space of nothingness, staying a bit when the statue is not there, just to consider that we restore a certain form of time. We don't impose that time like the artist Mark Quinn did, replacing Colston by another figure to create a new capitalization of that person. That statue have been dismantled really quickly, and suddenly she arrived to a gallery of the artist to be sold. So this is the story of the capitalism, which is repeat again and again, and it's really a violence against Black body and not a celebration at all. So that's it. And just to tell you, but we will keep on that conversation, during the March event, we talk about also practice of carnival as monumental practices from the Caribbean, but also sound system are monument for the Caribbean people too. So if you take things that is ephemeral, in movement, in motion, always renew, we come back to what I was talking about. We are talking about the storyteller, a practice of monumentality, which is not based on a stable artifact, but based on practice and repetition.
Great, thank you. I saw Ruth, you had your hand up for a while. Is there a question that you'd like to ask? And nice to see you on here.
Thanks, Eve. Olivier, I think your ideas are extremely exciting. I have some observations, just brief observations that I'm not even sure. I don't want to formulate a particular question, but I want to flag up things that struck me that I think you could speak to a bit more. For example, you spoke about the plantation story, people fleeing the plantation, but the story including the imagination of life beyond the plantation. And you referred to people having left a sort of maroon experience. And the suggestion I felt of speaking back. But I wondered if you could say a bit more about that idea of going beyond the plantation and being out in that other space, the scope for speaking back. Now, that's tied in to another angle, which is our time. Because the whole idea of the dynamism of thinking and moving in space and time is key to all of this, because it means that we become proactive within the storytelling experience. And so we become part of the story too. And in that same way, we are beyond plantation in some ways, and therefore that we could see within those blueprints ways that could inspire us as we try to speak back. this, I think, is really important because for me, the value, I mean, there's much to be said about Sylvia Wynter. But the thing that I find really powerful about Sylvia Wynter is that I think she's one of the few thinkers of our time who looks forward always. And so I feel that her voice is going to play an important part for us in the 21st century as her presence is brought more into the public domain, and will guide us and guide our young people and generations behind my generation, for example, as well as generations ahead, will guide us as we go into the 21st century in terms, and this is on the human level now, this is everybody. We're all humans, but guiding us into figuring out how do we experience humanity in a way that is a significant improvement on how we have done it in the past. And this is, as we are to look after our planet going forward, we need to do something. We also need to do something about looking after self, the human self. How do we value humanity in a better way? Of course, what's happening in the world around us at the moment makes that an extremely timely conversation. I'm not going to bring in the current events, but I just know that we're all concerned about this. So this blueprint concept, which has in it opportunities for us to see fragments of truth or models that we can incorporate into the practice of our own lives as we try to do better as people together, telling the stories of the past, telling the stories of now, imagining the stories of the future. Could you say a bit more about that, please?
Yeah, you say already a lot about that, and so I do think that you're right. But just to say that for me, perhaps I can say frankly also a form of purpose of what I'm trying to do in that research. I will call it, in a way, a practice of de-metaphorization of the politics. Indeed, we can consider that telling the story, I'm coming from the world of the art, of the storytelling, of the writing, but it happened that finally, on a very important and crucial moment we are living in, producing stories is not considered anymore as an active political practices, but just something out of the political scope. We are doing beautiful artwork, beautiful, but I do try to insist in that research of the capacity of the storytelling to become a tool for building a future, but not only as a magic spell. I'm going to explain it. For years, I've been very interested, like all the people, and produced one films about her, about the Donna Haraway proposal about when she says we need new storytelling. And I totally agree with what Donna Haraway was saying. We need other storytelling, and for me, it was related to the storyteller of the plantation. For her, it was coming from the tradition of radical feminism. But we were in the same line in that idea of the need of new stories. But there is something more that I learned through the last year, my practice as an activist, my practice as a researcher now, that we need also to create the condition of realization of our stories. Otherwise, we will keep on creating that, what I call the metaphorization of the politics, meaning that we need to create some conditions. And when I'm talking about the storytelling, I'm talking also a practice of presence, a practice of coming back on ground, a practice of concrete relationship with people, and not only talking about abstractions. So using the poetics, but in a very serious and political way, always coming back to the ground. When we have been in London, it was really incredible, productive for me. Just the day after we practiced together that storytelling, to go for a walk in New Cross and with Natalie Hyacinth, and to come back to places from the Jamaican and Bajan communities, meaning that it was, for me, the spiral, coming back to some important places, keeping that placing alive and trying to understand the blueprints of the Black revolts in that neighborhood, to try to keep on developing them. And in those places, for instance, it was the end of the practice of the sound system cause of the gentrification. And gentrification is a central question for London and from Paris, and for the Caribbean communities of the two cities. How we can keep on having some practicing relate to streets, relate to public spaces, relate also to our house, because we like to invite people. It's really a tradition in Caribbean context to invite people in your house. But you need to have a house to be able to invite people in. You don't need to live in really small rooms in bad conditions. It's not only a question related to the person. In a Caribbean culture, is the capacity of inviting people is central, because the host is the most precious figure. The host, so what I can offer to you is a part of my humanity. So the incapacity of practicing culturally, that practice of hosting, inviting people, is really a violence by the gentrification. And because we can't use the public space anymore, you know, we saw how the laws in London try really to policing the practice of the space with the sound system, how each law is related to an attempt of not allowing people to make some gatherings. And the same things in France relate to security, and all the Islamophobia in France is based on the use of the space too. The incapacity in the outskirts to do what we used to do, all the party we did outside, we can't do it anymore. So for me, it's really that idea of pointing the importance of the storytelling as a tool of a world-making practice, but trying to go until the condition of realization of it, trying to challenge to the how can do it, how can practice it, how can practice the world to come really for one day, for one afternoon, for a few hours.
Olivier, I think these are some fantastic contributions, and I wanted to thank you as well for acknowledging and speaking to Haiti right at the beginning of this talk, because I think that is absolutely what you've been saying is how can we have these abstract discussions without bringing it to the here and now, and without acknowledging the absolute centrality, right, of Haiti to all of these questions that we're talking about, and to be not only acknowledge that fact, but also cognizant of everything that Haiti is giving us, right? And I think we have a lot to honor Haiti for, and to recognize how this is just completely interwoven into all of the discussions that we're having today. So I wanted to thank you for that. The other thing that you were saying about spaces, I was just thinking about the cost of living crisis in the UK at the moment as well. So I think they announced this week that 50% of nightclubs have closed down. And that actually, when we think about young people, and we think about the impact of austerity over the past decade or 12 years or so, is that you're absolutely right. There are spaces now where community groups, where young people, where different groups of people just can't congregate, either because they can't afford to physically occupy those spaces because they're being priced out of those areas, be it through gentrification or whatever, but also because they're essentially being they're being pushed away from these not just areas, but the opportunity to congregate and the opportunity to fight against the kind of individualistic culture that is so dominant in the UK. So I thought that was a really important observation. We've got Engin Issen, who I've been very surprised to see. I haven't seen him for a few years. So thank you so much, Engin, for joining this seminar. He's got a question for you that says, "Thank you, Olivier. I am in a library, so I cannot speak. The storytelling figure as a figure of radical imagination is an inviting idea. I wonder if you consider this figure juxtaposed against the dominant truth-telling figure. If so, would you consider storytelling and truth-telling as different forms of repetition with opposing effects, e.g. emancipation versus domination?"
Yeah, it's a very clever question indeed, because I was on my way talking about Donna Haraway interest, and what have been for me the first contradiction of the Donna Haraway idea was the election of Donald Trump. because he was using an alternative storytelling. But he had the means to create the condition of the achievement of his idea. And suddenly I says, okay, the question is not only the quality of the storytelling, the inner quality, but the capacity of creating the condition of realization, of achievement of the storytelling. In the case of Donald Trump, the storytelling was quite simple and not so complex and not so well done, but very efficient. He says us, okay, I get that in the North American society, the minority, they create condition of emancipation through position themselves as a minority. Let's do it with white people. Let's say us white people in America, even if we are 70% of the population, 90% of the power, the richness, let's talk about us as a minority. And I do think that very radical, conservative, and racist statements have been very efficient, and it is ongoing in Europe too now. It's the same storytelling. And for me, I had in mind is, okay, we create a lot of storytelling, but we don't have the power to create the condition of realization, because I do think that in a certain way, our world of imagination is more based on the quality of stories, on the taste of stories, on the pleasure of stories, but not on the political condition of realization of those stories. And so the conservative, speculative narrative have been more efficient than us. And so it has been for me a kind of thing and so I came back to Donna Haraway with that addition of what she said. We need new stories, but we need to create conditions to achieve them. So I do think that the storyteller can be a counter figure if we consider that the storyteller had a particular goal in mind. He was not only there to tell a story, he was there to assemble a world possible to live. And as we said also just before, it was also here to echoing and assembling all the possibility of all the life around. To tell to people there is another possible form of life that existing, to convince people to that possibility. So in certain way, the storyteller is a political figure, is a real political figure in the worst situation we can imagine. So I do think that from there we can imagine something for us, because the situation of the plantation is a radical absence of horizon. People don't know what to do, where to go. And imagine that the Maroon revolts came from that nothingness, which is the life and enslaved people in the plantation. Is the limits, the zero level of any possibilities. And from there, from repeating fragment of small experiences, somebody leave, even somebody left the plantation and die after months. The storytelling of the master is, look, that guy tried to leave, or that woman tried to leave, and she died. But the storyteller will tell the story of the month of freedom. So he will tell a counter story, not talking about the death of the person, but about the taste of what he or she experienced with that freedom. So considering that fragment again as a blueprint, and not starting from the failure of that flight, but considering as an experience of freedom that have to be reproduced. That's where the storyteller is a powerful figure for me. I hope I answered the question, Hangit.
Thank you. So we have just a comment here. I don't know if you want to respond to it, from Kumar Mahabir, who says, please remember indentureship in the Caribbean too, a legacy of slavery. And then he just invites people to look at his book, which is called Caribbean Indian Folk Tales. Do you want to say anything to indentureship and how that fits into this picture?
No, I just have to say that it's a very important aspect of the Caribbean. And so for people from India, if you're talking so about the people from India, they came after the slavery time to replace slave as a worker for the sugarcane worker. And the legacy of the presence of India in the Caribbean is very important. And the intersection in between indigenous, Indian, and European and Afro descent people there is the base of a large part of the culture. And for instance, the Rastafari culture is also based on an intersection in between African background and Indian imagination and Indian culture. So there is a lot of things that is coming from that intersection too. And I won't say just look at that, but look also at the intersection of all those things that comes from culture.
Thank you. I am conscious we only have 10 minutes left and we've suddenly had a flurry of questions. So I'm going to try and read through them. And if you could keep your responses just within the time, Olivia, hopefully we can answer everybody. And I'll come to Rachel once I've read the questions in the chat. So Carol Ann Dixon says, thank you, Olivier, for such an interesting and insightful presentation. With regard to the two theories you referenced, I wanted to ask about another theory, that of patchworking. So in a similar way to both Sylvia Wynter and Saidia Hartman, the late Patrina Straw also undertook related archival research, specifically in reference to Caribbean visual arts practices. And she found that historically there was frequent use of textured, layered and collage surfaces, visual poetics and graffiti used as recurring techniques, and themes within Black feminist art imagined and created by African Caribbean descended women. She concluded that this occurred as a reflection of what she termed the patchwork nature of Caribbean women's creative practices, i.e. piecing together new visual narratives from the many fragments and interruptions of our history. And now her question, that was an excellent question so far. So do you agree that this phenomenon of patchworking might also be another example of how we might, as storytellers, literary, visual, musical and otherwise, achieve a sense of harmony, balance and completeness? Carol, wow, thank you. That's fabulous.
Yeah, it's a very good. I think I don't have to add anything because indeed the text is the answer of his own question. I do think that it's a very good remark. With a short space in the time for my presentation, I didn't dig deeper in the idea of the Creole also as a visual and a sonic practice. I talk a bit about sound system, but we have to consider that in the practice of the storyteller, there is a practice of image production by fragment that could be considered as patchwork. And I do insist in the idea of the collective practices, because I think the figure of the author, as we know it in the Western world, have been to be reconsidered through the figure of the storyteller as a person able to collectively produce that kind of patchwork without any owner, without any author. It's a very important aspect for me to try to dismantle the statue of the author as an owner of his own work and to create some collective practices and collective care. I'd call it in my work entretenir, so all everything together in a way. And that practice of entretenir, which means care in French, but it means in other way that talk about the kind of reciprocity and interdependency. So for me, the patchwork means something, but the patchwork can be considered as a flat images, as the idea of the metaphor of the Caribbean world. And I do believe the patchwork is very important if we're thinking in the dynamic way.
Thank you so much. Thank you for answering the question. I was particularly thinking of it because when you were talking particularly about Sylvia Wynter's work, I was reminded of Patrina Straw's diary pages, that decade in the 90s when she was writing about the visual arts. And so that's why that question came to mind. But I appreciate your response. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carol. So I think we had one person who had their hand up. I think that was possibly Rach. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, hang on, I'll put my video. That was me. Thank you very much for your talk. It was wonderful. And I just had a question linking on almost from that patchwork, I guess, thought, which I'd never been aware of. I'm like first year undergraduate at the minute, so I'm kind of learning as I go. My question was kind of like you were discussing on the archives around storytelling and this kind of thing of an oral tradition. And I went to an exhibition at Palais de Tokyo called Signal, and they kind of had this collection. It was called like Tigress, and they sort of had like an online collaboration. It was actually like a load of Palestinian artists that had sort of given their work, and then you could access it globally. And I wondered, as the world sort of becomes more digitalized, in sort of what way maybe like a space like that where you can almost upload like poems or visual culture or even like audio clips of people sort of telling their lived experiences, maybe like a positive way in different languages to maybe like connect people and form maybe and regenerate sort of like an archive in a positive way.
Yeah, I do think it's a very interesting remarks. I do think there is a lot of way of doing. I was trying also to relate things to the Caribbean culture, not in a form of exclusive practices. Of course, there is a lot of practice of storytelling in the Arab world, in the Western world, in the Asian world, and so it's more. It's not my perspective to say, okay, we are the only one of doing that. So we are human beings, as somebody said, so we are doing all the same things the same ways. I was more trying to stress something that you talk about the authorship, because I do think that we have to keep in mind, and Sylvia Wynter tried to do it with Plot and Plantation, to relate the foundation of the authorship in art, in literature, to the modern moment also of the slavery, of the way we create new category of ownership. And we always consider that things always been like that, and sometimes we have to see the very moment they have been created. For instance, I always, when I'm teaching about the art, I told to a student, I don't like when people says, oh, human being need art since, since the cave and prehistoric time, or human being always did art. But we don't speak about that art nowadays. We are talking about an art that has been created in the 19th century with the Cercle Bourgeois in France and in Germany. So don't do as if we are talking about the needs of people. Of course, we need a culture, because we are human beings, but there are a series of markets that are organizing our need of culture to make some very particular traduction of our needs for our market. So for me, coming back to the storyteller is obviously also a political question of the economy of culture. It's coming back to a figure that is trying, what is challenging the notion of author and the notion of authorship. So it's also a question asking from the Caribbean perspective in a capitalist world.
Thank you. Apologies, I was just responding to a request on the chat. Yeah, I think as we're wrapping up now, we were talking also at the event earlier this month about, I mean, you can't really talk about archives without talking about Stuart Hall and his I mean, I think it's very obvious, but his living archive and his approach to living archive, I think, is so helpful here, just simply because it's about a continuation of a narrative. It's about an ongoing conversation. It's about ensuring that you're putting contradictory voices in conversation with one another, and you're highlighting you're highlighting all the richness basically of human existence, right? So I think that Stuart Hall is kind of a real central figure in a lot of this. So that's a lot of how I interpreted what you presented today, Olivier. But please correct me if I'm wrong. We've got 5 minutes left, so I don't know if anybody has just one final question that they want to put to Olivier.
I would like to add something just about Stuart Hall.
Please do. Yeah,
it's very important for me to acknowledge.
Please do.
We are speaking after today. I was really concerned about the situation in Haiti, but my practice is also to acknowledge that I'm speaking after other people. It's again the practice of repetition. We are not the first who's saying that. A lot of people already said what we are saying today in other contexts and other way. So we don't have to look for a kind of new things by what I call practicing murder. We don't have to kill everybody before us to be able to create something new. We have to create that new form by repeating in a new context, in new condition. I'm talking about also for new researcher, new young artists, and so on. We don't have to create new thing by killing people before us. It's not. We don't need to do that, and it's not a good way of creating new things for our society. I do consider that we are doing repetition that are always new, because the context is always new, the voices is always new. We don't need to kill people to create new things. So, of course, I acknowledge the importance of Stuart Hall, of all I'm doing, and I try to repeat and to expand in the spirit of the storyteller all the work he did, which is for me essential.
Great. I think that's a good moment to kind of end the formal session. So I will stop recording now. Can we just say thank you once again to Olivier for those wonderful contributions?